Today our lecture is on Machiavelli, on Niccolo Machiavelli. And Niccolo Machiavelli is a Florentine who comes from the same city as Dante, but he's a very different character than his compatriot Dante Alighieri. In every IS course, we have one author that goes against the current, that goes عكس السير if you want to. In IS 203, we had Lucretius, who, although everybody believed in an afterlife and in some kind of spiritualism, he was the guy who believed in atoms and that we are all spread out and that there is no mastermind and there's no creator and so forth. In this text, in this course, we have Machiavelli. Machiavelli who challenges everything we've been so far studying and so far that we will be studying. Today, if you say Machiavelli, you think of two things. You think of devious leaders, politicians who are crooked or corrupt or harsh or cruel. But you also think of the word Machiavelli as an adjective, which means a devious scheme or something which is Machiavellian is quite, in fact, there are two cliches, if you want to, that go with Machiavelli. One of them is that the end justifies the means, which means that whatever you do, if it leads to the end that you want, is good. And the other is, in the field of political science, known as realpolitik, the real politics, the practical politics. Not politics as theories, but rather politics as practice, as praxis. So, this Machiavelli is from the 15th century. He's born in 1469 and he died in 1527, so he's 15th, 16th century. And as Dante had one foot in the Middle Ages and one foot in the Renaissance, this guy was also very much in the new revival of art and culture, which was the Renaissance, which means revival, reliving. Machiavelli was born in Florence, as I mentioned, and that he wrote in Italian, and the book is called Il Principe, or the Prince, which also, according to him, this is a guide for politicians on how to rule. So, in fact, it is a manual that he sent to Lorenzo de' Medici, who was the ruler of Florence at that time, to tell him how he wants the ruler to be. And in fact, Italy at this time was not the Italy that we later know. Italy was united in the 19th century, unified by Garibaldi and by Cavour and all of these people. And but the people of the North have always been different from the people of the South. As I mentioned last time, some people supported a pope, some people supported another pope, and there were lots of fighting between all the principalities: Florence, Genoa, Milano, Naples, Rome, and so forth. And at some point, there has been so much fighting and so much civil war between these cities that they had to resort to mercenaries, the condottieri, which he calls, are mercenaries that people had to pay them money to come and fight for you. And this murtazaqa, or these mercenaries, were of course unreliable because in times of extreme danger they could run away, or sometimes they would let you, they would blackmail you and want more money and more of compensations than usually you would get. So at this time, Florence is ruled by a person whom he is known as the Magnificent Lorenzo, who is a great prince. And then the reason why he writes this book, at the very beginning of this book, he has an introduction. And it is almost like a card you put in a present. When he wrote this book and sent it to the Prince of Florence, he put in it a small note, and he said, when you are a painter and you paint the mountains, you should sit in the valley And when you are painting the valley, you should sit in the mountains. So he said, and I quote, just as men who are sketching the landscape put themselves in the plain, and those who study the lowlands put themselves on high mountains, so to fully comprehend the nature of the people, one must be a prince, and to fully comprehend the nature of a prince, one must be an ordinary citizen. So you are sitting on the top as a prince, and you look down upon the subjects. And in order to understand how we conceive of you, I, an ordinary citizen, am sending you this book so that you understand a little bit how we hope that you will become as a ruler. Now, this book is a very small book. We're not reading it all. It has 5 main topics, which we are, in fact, only dealing with 4 and 5. The first topic, and if you follow your slides, which I have already posted, are general character of principalities. Sometimes principalities are hereditary, which means from father to son and father to son. And sometimes principalities are acquired, which means I do a coup d'etat, I kill the former king or prince and take over. Now, in hereditary ones, he says, it is much easier to rule because it's the same family, it's the same entourage, it's the same political clique. But when you are a newcomer to the rule and you overthrow a previous ruler, you have enemies all around you. And it is a bit to this particular group that he is addressing his book, because the Medicis were newcomers to the rules of Florence. And then he talks how people should organize their principalities or their kingdoms or whatever. How should a prince govern his conduct? And this is one of the most important things that we need to talk about. And why do principalities prosper and fail? In other words, is there one recipe? Or could it be that sometimes one king follows or one prince a certain way of ruling, another one comes, does exactly the same thing, but it doesn't succeed. So how does he explain that? So, in one of the things that he mentions, of course, is the character of this prince. And he calls it virtù. Virtù is an Italian word, which is not virtue, but it could be a virtue. But virtù is this kind of charisma, this kind of, a little bit macho kind of, Italian concept, who can impose himself on the people. And if a prince has virtù, almost part of his campaign is successful. Now, before I go further, I want to take a paragraph, which is, the reading, of course, is from the World Reader, from the big book. And on page 1095, he has a very interesting paragraph where he explains why he is interested in writing this book. And he says, since my intention is to write something which may be of use, I want to write something which is practical. It has seemed wiser for me to follow the real truth of the matter rather than how we imagine it. In other words, if you read this text, he is saying many people have wrote before me about theories of the good ruler or the good leader. And of course, people like Plato or Aristotle or religious leaders. You remember Plato talked about the philosopher king, and others talked about what is a good ruler. And he says, many have described what is a good ruler before me. But the difference between how one ought to live and how one actually lives is so wide. The difference between theory and practice is so wide that if we give up the practical for the sake of the theory, we may lead ourselves to downfall rather than preservation. So this is the main thesis of Machiavelli. Machiavelli says many people have written recipes of a good leader. These recipes are excellent, they're perfect, but they are not practical because they don't analyze the subjects how they act, they analyze how the ruler should act. And the difference between how you should and how you really are is so big, so vast, that if you give up one for the other, you will go to downfall rather than preservation. Now, if we take the classical view of a ruler, for example, if we take Plato's Republic, Plato in his Republic said the ruler should be a philosopher king. But who was the philosopher king? This was the person who had the four virtues of courage, justice, virtue, of temperance, and wisdom. And he hoped that it was only the very few who know, like the Socrates who comes out from the cave, that can be a ruler. If we go, for example, to the Romans at the time of Aeneas, they believed that the good ruler is the person who has pietas, who has duty, who knows the difference between what is right and what is wrong, who gives up his love like Aeneas did for Dido, and concentrates on God, the state, the family, and the children. Also, Aristotle talked to us about the virtues, how to be happy and how to be a good person, was to follow the golden mean, to avoid excess, to avoid deficiency, and to be a good ruler. Now, what is Machiavelli's aim? We always hear that Machiavelli is the end justifies the means. But what is the end? What is it that he wants? For him, the supreme end, the supreme obligation of a ruler is to maintain his power, to stay on the throne, and to secure the safety of his kingdom, of his country. In other words, to stay in authority and to grant security to the country. So, to avoid the country from inner problems and to avoid the country from external problems. Anything that stops this from becoming a reality, any obstacle to this is bad. Anything that contributes to the preservation of this end, this means, is good. So based on this relative concept of what is good and evil, therefore for him, the supreme aim and obligation of the ruler is to maintain the power and safety of the country over which he rules. Nothing should be allowed to stand in the way of this objective. Now, so what is if we're not going to use the rational approach that other philosophers took, but rather the natural, in other words, how do people really behave? What is the instinctive way of the subjects? Therefore, a prince should know, first of all, his subjects. If a prince knows how his subjects behave, then accordingly he customs tailors his rule according to his citizens. So, therefore, Machiavelli says, since I'm one of the citizens, let me tell you how we act, we as subjects. We human beings in a society, he says, we are not rational human beings. We are not all extremely well-behaved and religious and ethical. We are people who are instinctive. We are people who are impulsive. And therefore, because we are people who are instinctive and impulsive and act like animals, why should a ruler act in a orderly manner or in a rational way, since his subjects are not rational? So if your subjects are irrational, then the prince should be capable of dealing with an irrational group. So he starts by saying the populace, or the majority of the people, عامة الشعب if you want to, is fickle. What does fickle mean? It means today the people are with the ruler, tomorrow the ruler dies or goes or is overthrown, the next day they are with the new ruler. Or they tell him, we will support you with all our love and so on, but at the smallest incident, they might turn their backs. So, one of the things we have to know about these people is that the wish to acquire more is a very natural and common thing for the human being. So, these people want more and more and more and more. And sometimes they are, in a position to, not really keep their words. So, the wise ruler is no more the prince who knows philosophy and ethics and religious duties and commandments. It is he who relies on what he controls and not on what he cannot control. So, Machiavelli designs a system of ruling which is practical but not ethical. And here we have to be very careful, because not ethical in a city like Florence, which is extremely religious and Catholic. This was considered Machiavelli, his name is Niccolo Machiavelli, he was considered as the devil. And many of the religious leaders thought of his book as a book that should be thrown into the fire, because this book is teaching people how to be evil. But for him, as I said, evil and good were relative. If anything which contributes to the maintaining of the kingdom or the principality is good, then it is good. Even if it kills 100 people, it becomes good. Therefore, Machiavelli says, I am not against the virtuous man. I think the generous man is excellent. The man who doesn't lie is excellent. The man who keeps his promise is excellent. The man who is a patient man is excellent. The one who has friendship is excellent. These virtues are excellent to have in the character of a leader, provided that all men are good. If all men are good, then it is good to have good leaders. But since men are not entirely good, therefore a prince does not need to have all these virtues. He may pretend to have them, he may claim to have them, but in reality, it's not necessary that he should have them. What a prince should in fact do is that he should be flexible enough, resilient enough to be able to use the required characteristic of his personality wherever it is needed, rather than be fixed in his judgments or in his ways of acting. Therefore, what he should do is not act, but rather react. If for every particular condition he has an adequate reaction, then that would be the proper way of acting. For instance, and if you read the paragraphs that we have in the readings, which are not very long, it is good to be loved, but it is better to be feared. Because love, he says, is a sentiment which the prince owes it to the others. People who love me, he says, I have nothing to control it. But when I say they are afraid, it's because I have something in the ruler that makes the others afraid. A prince, he says, should not adopt the most ethical, but rather the most practical and the most profitable. Be good if possible, but know how to do evil if necessary. Now, of course, these are maybe many people, many rulers say that, but they don't say it openly. Maybe they say it hush-hushly alone. But to say this in print, written and published, was of course scandalous at that time. Now, there are a few restrictions that he says. You can do whatever you want as a prince, but first, avoid the hatred of the people. Do whatever you want, but do not let the people hate you. How can I be sure that the people will not hate me? There are two things which I should avoid. Avoid to attack their property and avoid to attack their honor. He says people sometimes forget the death of a father, but they don't forget the loss of a property, of a land. And at the same time, do not dishonor people by taking away their wives or their children, which is extremely personal. So respect their territory, the animal territory, if you want to, of property and honor. And this way, you will be safe. Now, all other things you can do. And therefore, instead of giving us examples from the how to act from the world of religious or biblical or philosophical text, he gives us examples from the animal kingdom. He says a prince should be like a centaur. A centaur is a mythical animal which is half animal, half human. So he says, try to be half human, it means use your brain, but also half animal, use your instincts and your power. Now, which animals does he recommend? A prince should be a fox and a lion, he says. You should be a fox to be shrewd enough to recognize the traps and to know where people are plotting against you. And you should be a lion to be strong enough so that the wolves don't eat you. So be half human, be half animal, but pick the right animals. Don't be a wise owl, but be a strong animal. So in the text that we read, for example, he asks questions. Which is better? Is it better for a prince, once he assumes power, to get rid of all his previous enemies in one shot? Or is it better to kill one person every day? Well, he says, no, the shock is much better because people are then scared so much that nobody would rebel. But if you do it in small installments, then you are gaining enemies every day and this will be against you. Another question he asks, if a prince makes a promise, should he keep it? Well, he says, when you made the promise, circumstances might have been different than when you are going to keep it. If the circumstances are the same, keep your promise. But if the circumstances are not the same, don't break your treasury or don't break your back to keep the promise. Forget about it. Do whatever works. Do whatever is convenient at the time. Now, the question then after he says, okay, so he gives, as we read the passages, we will see all these examples. And then he says, okay, if a prince follows everything I'm saying, do I have a guarantee that he will succeed? Well, he says, for example, we find that many leaders try to imitate Alexander the Great, and when they do the things that Alexander the Great did, they fail. Whereas others who imitate Napoleon, well, of course he doesn't know Napoleon, but who, for example, imitate another ruler, they succeed. So for him, not every theory is perfect. You have to examine things in the light of the circumstances you are in. And he then brings a certain concept which is very Italian. Now, in Italy, there was a belief that there was a goddess from the ancient times called Fortuna. And Fortuna is luck. Fortuna is a little bit like the wheel of the Yanasib. It turns. And she is also blind because she doesn't see who is winning, who is losing. And therefore, he says, sometimes half of the actions that we do are based on fortune also. For instance, he says, fortune or luck usually likes young people because young people take risks. And sometimes when they take risks, it works. And if it works, they succeed. Whereas elderly people are not very much in taking risks because they're afraid to have more to lose. So Fortuna, because she's a woman, sometimes he says you have to beat her, which is very chauvinistic, of course. But it means that you have to attack fortune and take control of fortune. But also he says, even if fortune is responsible for 50% of the acts that we do, this doesn't mean that we should not be prepared in future for repetitive actions. He says the first time things happened by accident. I wasn't prepared for it. There was a flood, the river flooded, it took away all the houses. But it doesn't mean if you live at the side of a river that next year you're not going to make any precautions. So he says, you have to be prepared, you have to be resilient, You have to have your antennas open and see whatever happens and be ready for it. Therefore, a Machiavellian prince is a prince who believes that in order to preserve his principality and in order to stay in power, everything is possible, everything is allowed, everything can be labeled good if it contributes to this, and everything could be labeled as evil if it stops the ruler from achieving this. Hence, the whole perspective of ruling and leadership takes a different approach with Machiavelli. So we will discuss more of this in class, on our Zooms, but it is a very provocative reading, so please read it and look forward to discuss this on Thursday.